welcome. I'm Thorsten Beck, Director of the Florence School of Banking and Finance here at the European University Institute. And I'd like to welcome you to this seminar on the financial sanctions on Russia. And I welcome Sony Kapoor, whom I will introduce in just a moment. This seminar is jointly organized with the International Law Working Group, a working group of PhD researchers in the law department of the EUI. Let me just point out that, of course, there are many other online events in the next few days organized by my colleagues here at the European University Institute, and you can find the latest schedule at eui.eu/events. Now, before we get to the topic of today, let me just make some introductory remarks, and you've seen also, of course, the introductory slide. The Florence School of Banking and Finance sees itself as a platform to bring together practitioners, regulators, and academics. As an academic institutions, we typically do not take political decisions, but rather offer a space to exchange ideas and opinions. Universities are typically neutral in the regular political discourse. But when democracy, freedom, and peace themselves are under attack, then we do take a strong stance, and it is a clear one against aggression and against invasion, as in the case of the bloody assault of Putin against Ukraine. The aggression has many aspects, and we will focus only on a specific one in the following 60 minutes, which is the financial sanctions. However, we should acknowledge the human suffering and destruction that is being unleashed on Ukraine by the Russian and Belarusian militaries. As we go into the discussion in just a moment, we should keep in mind that the objective of sanction is to stop this bloodshed as quickly as possible. Now, let me turn to our speaker today, to our guest, Sony Kapoor. Sony is Managing Director of the think tank Redefine and CEO of the Nordic Institute for Finance, Technology and Sustainability. He's also, since a few weeks, part-time professor of climate, geoeconomics and finance here at the European University Institute, more specifically the Robert Schuman Center. And I'm very happy to have him as a colleague going forward. Now, I've known Sony for quite some time, and there's so many topics I would love to discuss with Sony. I just mentioned some of them in my introduction, but here we are, and we're going to talk about these financial sanctions. So again, thank you, Sony, for joining us. And I know these been quite busy times for you, so I appreciate that you have taken out the time to talk to us today. And let me also just mention, by the way, Sony is very active on Twitter, and we might at some point also post his Twitter address, so you can also follow him there, and he will pick up on many of these issues that he mentioned on Twitter over the last couple of days. Now, Sony, before we get into the details, I want to have for you more like a political economy question. So what I was kind of surprised to see is the reaction of the European Union in a very positive sense. Typically, when we see 27 countries having to decide, making a quick decision on something such severe, you get typically the lowest common denominator. And that's what it looked like during the first 2 days. And then it suddenly all changed. And maybe we didn't get what everybody had wanted to, but we did quite get a heavy package of sanctions against Russia, which we're talking about in a moment. I mean, was this also surprising for you, or is it something you expected, or how do you explain that?
So back at the height of the Euro crisis, I used an unfortunate metaphor, which in retrospect, is a bit prescient, and which was that I said the best thing that can happen to the Euro crisis is if Russia fires an intercontinental ballistic missile through the airspace of the Baltics. There is nothing that concentrates the minds of any group of country or any country than an actual existential external security threat. And we haven't quite that didn't happen. But I think we saw the equivalent of this. This is the first time in living memory, at least for my generation, that most EU leaders and countries see what could really be a potentially, existential security threat And just as a rough example, I have kids in kindergarten in Oslo, and it became very personal when we got an urgent email asking all parents to give permission to all the kindergartens and schools. And this is a sort of Norway-wide thing, I think a Scandinavia-wide thing, to give iodine pills to children in case of a nuclear attack, right? I mean, it's not panic mongering. It's just good preparation, right? So they will have existing stocks, but it made it sort of very, very personal. And we are definitely a few seconds closer to the doomsday clock to midnight, as they say. So nothing of this scale and magnitude. And again, losing money is one thing, but losing life and liberty is quite another. And I think this has really been transformational.
Thank you. Yes, no, I think the personal aspect here, actually, I mean, it also kind of came home for me because two of the partners of two of my cousins are actually from Ukraine, and they have family in Ukraine, including in the areas that are being currently attacked. So, no, I certainly understand that. So, shall we talk very briefly about these financial sanctions? What, maybe to start with, what exactly do they imply? What exactly has been put into place by, and let's focus on the EU for the moment, but maybe also US and to a certain extent the UK?
Maybe it makes sense, to just take a slight step back and talk about, and you mentioned it right at the start. You said, the objective of sanctions is they're not an end in themselves, right? They're a means to an end, which is how to make them act as a deterrent to stop Putin and at least stop escalation, right? And so the challenge facing policymakers, Thursday night, Friday morning, what was as follows: what can we do that is non-military, that does not, risk the military escalation, potential nuclear conflict, that is seriously painful for Putin and Russia, to show him we mean business and to get him to stop, right? Now, a lot of people have been, especially from the environmental community, have been talking up, gas and oil, and we will talk about it today. But, let's say we stop buying Russian oil and we stop buying Russian gas immediately, right? Frankly, with $630 billion of foreign exchange reserves, with all these assets of the oligarchs and Russian private citizens effectively at the disposal of an authoritarian Putin, right? Because he has the ability to command all of Russia's resources. He has reached that level of authoritarianism, right? So just cutting off the income would have done absolutely nothing, right? I mean, it would have been like a pea shooter in response to a bazooka. So the question is, how do you, so the logic of sanctions goes as follows. I think there are 5 things to consider that we looked at. So the first was timeline. It had to be front loaded. The impact had to be front loaded now. Second, scale. It had to be big, macro significant to the size of the Russian economy, right? Third, scope. So ideally, most Russians are innocent, right? I mean, they have not played part of this. They are being themselves. They've lived under Putin's suppression. Many of them are in jail.
Including the soldiers who are currently in Ukraine, many of them. Now, that's just to remember that.
Exactly, young conscripts not knowing what they are, meant to do. Most of them, potentially having no other employment opportunity, given, the dire state of Russian economy, right? So the ideally, we would have liked to have kept it narrow, right? So clearly there was an element, how do we put the squeeze on Putin and his friendly oligarchs and, squeeze him? But this goes to the earlier point I made. I'm afraid that is not possible in an economy where he has effective command and control. And if he doesn't, he can easily have the capacity to seize any assets that he doesn't have command and control, right? So very tragically for, most ordinary Russian citizens, and I send my apologies to them, there is no way around inflicting pain across the Russian economy. And so that is why the scope is broad. Of course, there are all these named individuals who've been sanctioned, etc. But it had to go beyond that, right? I mean, that just would not have been enough. Number 4 is is the asymmetry, right? So ideally, you would want sanctions because clearly, in a global trading financial system with integrated economies, and Russia has been quite integrated, despite seeking to distance itself recently with the global economy and particularly with the European economy, right? We needed sanctions that were asymmetrically painful, that inflicted most of the pain within Russia rather than on us or the rest of the world. So timeline, immediate, scale, big, scope, ideally narrow, but had to be broad. And fourth, asymmetric to inflict maximum pain within Russia, right? So those were the four criteria, main criteria to design sanction. Now here, now I go back to the gas issue, right? So if there financial audience in the listening in, it's basically stock versus flow, wealth versus income, right? And you can stop, if someone is reasonably wealthy, and by most conventional measures, Russia had reasonable, several $100 billion of assets at its disposal, was wealthy. Even if you cut off all income today, they could comfortably live by. The much bigger impact, and of course, historically in the time of war, there have been across most wars in history, seizures of wealth and assets. So the only sensible thing to do, which was large enough and immediate in effect, was to target assets, the stock of wealth, rather than the flow, right? So this is not to say that we will not target the flow or that shouldn't be targeted, but we will come to that question, but just in terms of size. And so here, that was why, decision was taken immediately to focus on financial rather than economic sanctions that include trade embargoes, etc. So that was the logic I wanted to begin with.
And have you seen any impact already on this, of these sanctions?
Yeah, so in I used an unfortunate metaphor in an interview with the Wall Street Journal over the weekend, where I called it the equivalent of exploding a nuclear bomb in the for Russia in capital markets, and that was I think a few hours before Putin escalated his nuclear forces to the next level of alert, and I'm just hoping there was no link between the two. But it has been so very, the very frank assessment is that the impact has been so okay, there's two ways, right? So as you started, the objective is to stop Putin, right? Has Putin stopped? No. So in that sense, it has, these sanctions have failed so far. If anything, he's escalated his brutality, right? But the objective in terms of, the size and the speed of impact, that has gone even beyond the most optimistic expectations that policymakers had. And for a number of reasons. One, any narrow sanction in itself creates a significant scope for evasion. So what has been very important, which is why, from the first day, from Friday when the SWIFT issue was being discussed, I was very clear that SWIFT is necessary, desirable, but clearly not enough. You have to sanction the central bank, and this goes to the issue because SWIFT attacks the flow and asset seizures and freezing central bank reserves. It directly addresses the wealth, right? And so the combination of SWIFT, of blocking sanctions on banks, which in some ways goes beyond SWIFT, because SWIFT is just a messaging system. A blocking sanction means you're forbidden to deal with the bank in any way, and if you do, you will be penalized, just in the same way that BNP Paribas and a few other European banks were made to pay several billions of dollars to the US Treasury for violating the sanctions of Iran, right? So there's a clear precedent here that you will be made to pay a price if you deal with institutions that are part of blocking sanctions. So it was the surround, sort of shock and awe effect of these multi-pronged sanctions against specific oligarchs, against Putin and close political allies, central bank assets, the messaging system, and blocking sanctions across many, many banks. So all of that combined with what was a very deliberate and again, in hindsight, what has turned out to be more successful than could have been hoped for strategy of turning Russian assets or any dealings with Russia into something that is entirely toxic, more or less overnight. So one of the things that I have been, very pleasantly surprised by is how large a role self-sanctioning has played, in addition to the official legal sanctions that have been put in place, and how both of them have been amplifying each other. So in short, they haven't yet deterred Putin, but the financial economic pain is very, very real. And in our estimate, just in a hypothetical scenario, that we reach a détente and a truce is signed and Russia is rehabilitated within a week or so, we think that already there's been at least somewhere between 50 to I had written 150 billion, but now I think 250 billion dollars of permanent wealth destruction for Russia that has already happened, even if all sanctions were reversed fairly quickly. So that is the scale of damage that has been done.
Thanks, Tony. Now, leakage, you mentioned it already, I think, yourself. So, I mean, is there I guess, several issues with leakage, right? So one is on the country level.
Yeah.
And we've seen, again, surprisingly, maybe Switzerland also following suit, or I'm not quite sure how extensively. The UK, supposedly, though, I mean, I had some big question marks on how aggressively they're actually going against the oligarchs, given that the political system is so penetrated with the links between the oligarchs and the Tory party. And then, of course, but also on the sanctions themselves, not all the banks have been targeted, right? So there are some kind of, there are kind of built-in leakages. Does that worry you?
Not particularly, so, and this goes to the stock versus the flow issue. So I think in terms of, asset freezes, so there have been several things that have been done to assets, right? So I think the two most important of those are asset devaluation. So let's say, Russia had, 100 units of assets before at market price, right? And more or less overnight over the weekend, those fell in value by somewhere between a third and 2/3, right? So suddenly the value of your wealth, even if you were allowed access to it, was very substantially hit, right? And again, you may allow transactions, you may allow someone to, liquidate that wealth, but liquidating means somebody has to buy. And if nobody is ready to buy, that $100 is only worth $30 or $20 now, right? So again, the first order effect is asset devaluation. Anything that has Russia associated with it is worth far, far less now than it was on Thursday last week. Number two, even the devalued assets, and clearly, the Russian central bank holding US treasuries. I mean, the US treasuries haven't been devalued, right? So not all assets have been devalued, but those, a very substantial amount of them, and again, depending on the exact definition and the details, easily half of those have been frozen. But it's quite likely that effectively, to all intents and purposes, we may have as much as 2/3 of those assets, including those of Russian central bank, frozen. And as you said, in the beginning, it was primarily the EU and the United States. The UK join has been becoming stronger and stronger. This has become a huge domestic political issue in the UK. Switzerland was finally bullied into joining. And then Japan was not part of the original G7, right? So the G7 included the EU instead of Japan, but Japan joined. And I think more and more emerging economies. And again, there is formally joining the sanctions. And then there is de facto joining the sanctions. So I think the de facto coalition that has signed up to the sanctions is much broader and is growing every day. So I think it's fair to say somewhere between, you know, half to 2/3 of assets at market value that Russia could have access to have effectively been frozen. Now, on top of that, there's a third treatment of assets, which is asset seizures. And we woke up this morning to the news of, you know, both in Germany and in France, 2 oligarch yachts being seized. Now, of course, you know, it's very visible and, you know, it makes everybody take notice. But the fact of the matter is that Putin could have drawn on the assets of many of these oligarchs. And those have either been frozen, and in many cases, they have, you know, of course, there's a whole legal process, right? We cannot go around willy-nilly, randomly deciding this person is the enemy of the state and seizing their assets. You know, that way lies total disaster. So there's a process in place. But many of the assets that have been frozen already will, I think, slowly percolate into asset seizures. And that's something, you know, we can talk about at the end, which is what to do with all the assets that have been frozen and seized. So just going to the leakage issue. So the things that we are permitting leakages on are the payments for commodity and fossil fuel exports. And that's a very deliberate thing. That's why Gazprom Bank has not been sanctioned. And there, you know, I'm completely supportive of that measure, and we can discuss that next about, and this links to the targeting wealth versus targeting income issue. So I think, you know, there's huge frictions that have been introduced, and of course, you know, there are some leakages in place, but the leakages are being tightened as the sanctions get broadened, as the coalition, de facto coalition signing up to the sanctions get broadened, and as more and more self-sanctioning takes place, right? So nobody is stopping anybody from buying Russian oil, but you know, even as the price of oil has risen dramatically, you know, Maersk is not going to use its tankers to load Russian oil, right? Traders are stopping to buy Russian oils from legal entities that are seen to be close for Putin. So Russian oil is trading at a huge discount, even as, you know, the size of, and then the thing with the you know, permissible transaction, the not kicking, you know, Gazprom Bank off SWIFT, etc., is whatever's going through can be monitored, right? So it's not as if unrestricted payments will be allowed. So it is a very visible channel, you know, SWIFT messaging system, all these international regulators have access to, etc. I think the scope for leakage is much less than people suspect.
Okay. Maybe to stay with the theme of leakage for just a moment. So I think you partly also already answered the question here that I saw in the Q&A box by Patrick Onahan, that there are not everybody's being targeted, right? I mean, you said you have all the people who are close to Putin, but of course, as you said yourself, Putin has, I mean, increasingly control of the whole economy, and I mean, how easy is it actually to distinguish between people that are close to Putin and people that are supposedly not close to Putin? So that's one question. Second, China. I mean, can China help Russia kind of circumvent the sanctions? Third point, crypto. To which extent can crypto help Russia avoid these financial sanctions?
So on all three, the answer is a, you know, lukewarm, potentially yes. And let's talk about each of them in turn. So the first is, you know, anyone who has a footprint in Russia, and that could include, you know, family in Russia, right, or the legal entities in Russia, or there are any physical seizable assets in Russia, or a part of, you know, claim on Russian assets, etc. Having threatened nuclear war, right? There is no way that Putin will not use every single tool at his disposal, right? So I think that distinction of, whether you are friendly to Putin, less friendly, if he can get to you or your family or seize any sorts of assets, so he will do. So I think that's the criteria to look at. Two-pronged, you want to make sure that Putin cannot access even the foreign assets of anybody who seemed to be, friendly to him, right? But at the same time, we also need to minimize his ability to seize assets and get assets from anybody who has a Russian footprint, whether they're friendly to him or not. And that's sadly where, the collateral damage comes in. And it's a question of judgment. So there will be some, unfortunate decisions. People who do not support the war might see a huge amount of collateral damage. They have already. But this is the fog of war, and this happens, in every single war.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Let me just interrupt you, because that actually relates to a point that was raised in the Q&A box by Alessandra Codi. A proposal by Thomas Piketty, basically arguing it's not about targeting just Russia itself or targeting certain oligarchs, but just saying, well, let's take the, 1,000, 10,000 richest Russians, and let's just target them. I mean, as you said, there will be collateral damage, but war is war, right? After all, is that something you would also kind of relate to?
Well, this raises, and again, so while working on the sanctions over the weekend, I struggled with a very difficult moral calculation, and we all remember the dark, shameful history of the Japanese internment camps in the United States and all of the other times where all ethnicities from enemy states have been targeted, right? And we are not Russia, we are not China, right? We are supposedly the liberal Western order trying to have a rules-based system. And so I am, so it makes me very deeply uncomfortable and if you saw, there was, a tweet by Ambassador McFaul yesterday from the United States, saying that basically, all Russians are to blame, right? And that commentary has been happening. And if you saw, there have been several Russophobic hate attacks already happening in schools in Europe, where Russian-speaking children have been targeted, etc. Right? And this is getting towards collective punishment. And of course, the sad, tragic reality, and this goes to the issue which I started, you would really ideally want the sanctions to be narrow, right? To minimize damage, collateral damage to ordinary citizens. But it is a trade-off. And I do not think that an indiscriminate targeting of, Russian wealth, legitimately or illegitimately acquired, and, is the way to go. I think there has to be an element of intelligence. There has to be an element of, some burden of proof, which could be either closeness to Putin or Putin's ability to access assets, right? Which may not be the two same things. And if it's the latter, then it should just be a temporary freeze rather than a seizure of assets, right? We don't want people who have made legitimate money, who are not supporting the war, to suffer in the long term. So separate between, asset seizures and asset freezes. But yeah, I mean, I think this collective punishment thing, that is unavoidable. Russian ordinary citizens are once again, for the second or third time in their lifetime, going to lose all of their savings, which is horrible and tragic, but it's just impossible to avoid. So it's a very difficult moral calculation, but really anything that borders on, collective punishment, targeting, Russian identity, Russian language speakers, imposing loyalty test, reeks of McCarthyism and, Japanese internment camps. And I'm very deeply uncomfortable with those.
Shall we go to China?
Yeah. So this is, so absolutely, right? I mean, so only if macroeconomically speaking, the only country that could help Russia sustain through, if this becomes a long sustained conflict, which is likely, is China. That is the only one with the muscle, with the ability to repurpose, redirect imports from Russia, and of course, support it financially. Now, I cannot read, the mind of President Xi, but I think that, from what I hear from my sources, this has really the overwhelming outpouring of support and the scale of action has really, really caught China off guard. They were not expecting this level of support, this speed of action, and the sheer breadth of sanctions, as well as the self-sanctioning, right? I mean, effectively, BP said, okay, here's $25 billion down the toilet. This is untouchable. We're not going to do this, right? And if you start collectively adding up, there's been several hundred, several tens of billions of dollars of voluntary damage that people have done. Maybe people will start throwing, Russian vodka on fire or something. Who knows? And I think, so at least on the macro significant, large Chinese state-owned banks that are part of it. And we have to remember, China is far more deeply integrated into the global financial and trading system in far more complicated ways than Russia is. And it is a far, far larger economy, right? So much, much more at stake. So you don't want, as a large Chinese state-owned bank, to get caught in secondary sanctions, which is enabling others to circumvent sanctions. So will there be, let's say, backroom support? Will China help Russia access some dollars by swapping yuan in a way that is not clearly visible to the outside world? Yes, absolutely, right? But I think the early signs at least are that so if China were to wholeheartedly put in its lot with Russia, then the leakage will be macro significant. But as long as it's piecemeal, occasional, small efforts that are hard to detect, that are hard to, for the outside world to find out, I think that will continue. So China will help, Russia some, but I think not enough to blunt the substantial, deep damage from sanctions.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's also reflected in the vote. I think they abstained yesterday in the UN General Assembly vote. They didn't vote against the statement that condemning Russia, the Russian invasion. So that's maybe also points a little bit to what you're saying. They're going to help some, but they're not going to be stand up and kind of replace the Western financial system with their own with their help. Shall we go to crypto? What is crypto an escape route?
Again, I think at a micro level, yes. Are there channels, anonymized channels through which Russians or Russian sources can access dollar funding indirectly through crypto channel or use crypto for payments? Of course, but no, I do not think they're macro significant. And if they appear to start to become macro significant, we have enough between the Fed and the ECB and the BOJ. We have enough regulatory tools, informational advantage to be able to crack down sharply on them. As of today, I do not think those additional tools are necessary. And if you saw what the FBI did with the with the great big and it took several years to sort of go through it, but I really think that crypto is the crypto channel is, at least as of now, not macro significant.
Okay, that's also reassuring, I would say. Now let's talk about, I mean, we mentioned already a little bit about the impact. And I mean, we see some impact, of course, in markets that still function, like the ruble exchange rate. But I mean, what do you kind of foresee in the next days, actually, or weeks, concerning the impact on the Russian financial system? I mean, we saw pictures of people not being able to use Apple Pay in the metro in Moscow. So little things that will disturb the daily life, but of course that doesn't mean that the financial system as such will collapse immediately. But how do you see this playing out over the next couple of days, weeks, maybe months?
So if you remember, over the weekend, there were a lot of people, warning about bank runs in Russia, right? So two parts to that. Number one, if as a Russian citizen, you can primarily, go to the ATM and withdraw rubles, right? Would these sanctions put an existential threat to your ability to access the rubles in your bank? And the answer is absolutely no, right? So many of those at the prima facie level were exaggerated, and I would say were part of the information campaign to deliberately induce panic in the Russian financial system, right? So this goes to the idea of this multi-pronged strategy of devaluing Russian assets, reducing access to them, etc. So really, we wanted people to start panicking and lining up outside their banks, because that creates domestic pressure, right? I mean, so at a purely rational level, I think the risks to the viability of a ruble-based domestic financial system in Russia in the near term are limited, right? But clearly, more printing of rubles and the transmission channels are large, right? So more or less overnight, the Russian central bank had to double its interest rate to about 20%. Now, of course, that has a huge impact on the domestic economy, right? And if it starts printing rubles, it's going to be, not just inflation, but eventually, if this lasts long enough, some semblance of hyperinflation. And we've seen this happen in other places that have been sanctioned. Venezuela is one example. So yes, of course, on a weekly basis, I don't think that the Russian domestic financial system faces an existential threat, but over a month, over 6 months, all bets are off. So huge negative domestic impact on the welfare of citizens, the real value of their income, and through the interest rate channel. Huge recession in Russia. In fact, stagflation stuff, right? So high and rising prices, particularly as import embargoes start to bite, combined with high interest rate as Russia tries to stop flight of even more dollars abroad. That would be devastating. But I think the channel is through the economy rather than the viability of ruble-based banking system in itself.
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, what we see now in other countries, and even countries without any sanctions, I mean, take Brazil in the 90s, is that the financial sector basically but reduces significantly its role as an intermediary and focuses completely about just making money, basically kind of an inflation tax by holding on to payments, for example. So that's that. But all of this, of course, you could argue is not something that can then put immediate pressure on the economy. I mean, given all of your points about stocks, flows, and so on.
Yeah.
And I mean, similarly, we can also say, and we can talk about this maybe also in a moment. I mean, you can compare the current sanctions against Russia with the sanctions against Iran, for example.
Yeah.
It has been in place for many, many years. And I mean, of course, we don't want to get into the politics about the Iran sanctions, but of course, you can see what exactly was the purpose of that. But it hasn't really caused a collapse of the regime in Tehran. Then the question arises here, I mean, what is ultimately the goal? Yes, we want to stop the bloodshed, but can we really expect, and I take your point on the stocks versus the flows, but can we really expect any immediate effects, and what's ultimately, I mean, what do we want to achieve? I mean, where do we, with these sanctions, where do we, I mean, given that the military attacks are going to continue, maybe in 2, 3, I don't know how many weeks, Ukraine will have fallen. I mean, what is the goal? What do we want to achieve ultimately?
Well, so interesting you mentioned Iran. So, you know, on Friday, you know, I put something in public, which is basically saying that, you know, Iran sanctions are the appropriate template. And, you know, Iran is sort of, you know, 9 out of 10 on scale as of today. And the initial bout of sanctions announced against Russia were only 4 or 5 out of 10. And we need to, you know, include the central bank and, you know, trade embargoes, etc. Right? So the problem is as follows, twofold. And this is the difference between the two. So in Iran, the objective was long-term. It would have taken Iran, you know, a few months, years in any case, to develop nuclear capability, right? So the objective was to stop that happening, and that included trade embargoes, you know, central bank asset freezes, etc. Right? Here, the objective is to stop the war, stop the bloodshed now, ASAP, right? So the timeline between those two is very different. So the focus or the emphasis of the Iran sanctions was to squeeze the income, and the focus of the Russian sanction is to squeeze the assets as of today, because we really want to front load the pain. So, you know, the Russian sanctions are far more front loaded. So that's point one. Part two, and again, you know, we've discussed this issue several times. Tragically, you know, the biggest burden of the Iran sanctions have been borne by, you know, innocents, collateral damage, population, who have not contributed to, you know, whatever they're being sanctioned for, right? And in fact, just like with prohibition, anytime you impose any rules, the elite can find ways of circumventing that, and that is actually very profitable. Like black markets are very profitable. So the elite have done, you know, and the Republican Guard in Iran have done reasonably well out of the sanctions, but the population and the economy as a whole has suffered. So here, you know, directly seizing the assets of Putin and his oligarchs, etc., has had more personal impact on the elite. But sadly, I think the longer this goes, you know, the impact on the general population is sadly unavoidable, and which brings to the third point, right? So for a man who created war out of nothing, has now on more than one occasion threatened, you know, nuclear annihilation, saying, well, if Russia doesn't exist for the world, you know, what good is the world for us? Right? If Russia is not accepted by the world, is there anything that can stop him? And with that, you know, with that thinking hat on, sadly, the tragic answer is no. You know, there is short of a coup, a generalized uprising, you know, the military refusing to obey illegal orders, you know, it's not going to be in the timeline. And I think you were correct in your timeline, right? I mean, like it's on a daily basis. I wake up and the first thing I check is Zelensky alive, right? I mean, this is an hour by hour, minute by minute existential threat to the leadership of Ukraine, and you know what it will do to the morale of people there, etc. Right? So every second is precious, and I think in that time horizon, it's unrealistic to expect any kind of financial sanction that we could possibly deliver, even if we went all out, even if we went, you know, 15 out of 10 on the Iran model. There is really literally nothing we can do to stop a madman continuing his violent assault on a day-by-day basis, right? And I think here, you know, so what has been fascinating, and I spoke about, you know, the self-sanctioning part. So thus far, it's focused primarily on financial sanctions, you know, asset seizures, right? But what we're seeing, and this is where the Apple Pay decision and Visa and MasterCard, etc., what was fantastic. And if you saw yesterday, there was this huge discussion about how long would the Russian air fleet be able to operate absent repairs and spare parts. And I think that is where that is the stuff that is the next level, and a coordinated effort to essentially, to all intents and purposes, bring the Russian economy to a dead halt. So just as a rough example, I think most people would either have an iPhone or have Google ecosystem of some kind, Android ecosystem, right? Now, I don't know technically if that is possible, but imagine if all Russians woke up next morning being unable to use any Android-based or Apple-based phone system whatsoever, if their phones were remotely frozen, right? What happens, and Russia is not a manufacturing haven anymore, and is so dependent. What happens if every single spare part, every single thing in every car, maintenance, everything just stops, right? There is a lot of scope to really tighten the stranglehold beyond purely financial to real economy sanctions. And again, thus far, it has been mostly self-sanctioning, voluntary, but one could easily see this either being, coordinated in a strategic way or become statutory, by forbidding any EU, US, Japan registered, Switzerland registered firm to do any business with Russia, seizing immediately, right? So there's a lot of scope for this. But again, I'm assuming most Russian armed forces, ammunition, etc., are not linked to US defense contractors in terms of spare parts, etc. So I think Putin's ability to narrowly wage war and visit destruction in Ukraine will not be immediately impacted.
It's basically undermining more in the medium long term any further aggression also beyond Ukraine, and make it clear that basically take away the economic basis for further imperialism.
I mean, essentially, it's a terrible metaphor, but essentially, visiting nuclear war upon the Russian economy. Yeah. That is what we've begun to do. That is what we can do, and short of direct military confrontation, that is what we can, and we hope that then induces the population to rise, or people in the inner circle to see the writing on the wall, and do something about it. But yeah.
But probably the second one would be kind of the preferred. I mean, I think it's. I would personally say it's more likely to see the second one than the first one, because we've seen demonstration across cities in Russia, and you've seen unfortunately the limited impact of them, right? So that's yeah. So I have a couple of very specific questions, and we're kind of getting also. It's already 10-1 now, but Russia is, and Michael Wenschlag is asking this, Russia is very close to missing payments on its public debts. Yeah. And I think it's foreign exchange debt, right? So, I mean, what implications will that have? Is that just, it's just like adding insult to injury, or is it kind of actually have an additional kind of?
No, I mean, so if you, first thing on Monday, Russia introduced capital controls. It hasn't called them capital controls, but the two were, it forbade the transfer of, dollar-denominated payments abroad. So number one. Second, it introduced a requirement of 80% of any FX earned from any export by any company would have to be surrendered to the central bank, both of which are classic capital controls. And I think yesterday it announced an additional measure, which was saying, even on domestic payments, non-Russian resident holders of domestically denominated bonds will not get paid, which is another level of capital control, right? So I think the safe assumption is that Russia is going to default on all obligations to foreigners, be it dollar denominated or domestic currency denominated. And from their point of view, it makes sense, right? I mean, if you're so scarce of dollars and you've been cut out of FX, then your first objective is to conserve as much FX as possible. And all three of these are, so I think we will see a further tightening of capital controls. And given that we have cut Russia out from our capital markets, forbidden Russia to be able to borrow, what is the point of maintaining access to capital markets from which you simply cannot borrow, right? So I think it's default, there's a grace period, so it hasn't been sort of formally triggered, but I think for all intents and purposes, default has happened.
Do you see any impact, or at least immediate impact, on the banking system in Western Europe? I mean, we've seen this Sberbank Austria losing their banking licenses effectively, but of course there were no knock-on effects, so that was fairly easy to handle. But do you see any broader implications for European banks from these sanctions? I mean,
I think nothing, macro significant. And I mean, it has been remarkable. And, you and I both worked on the financial sector reform after the GFC. And, they have made our banking system stronger. Surveillance is better. Our understanding of exposures is better. The role for centralized settlement systems is better. Tier 1 capital ratios for most banks are much higher, and increasingly, branching was discouraged and subsidiarization was encouraged, which meant that a lot of the exposures were ring-fenced across countries and don't spill over. And I think there might be a failure or two here and there. But I think for the most part, I do not expect it to lead to any large macro financial instability in the Eurozone or in the EU. What is an issue, and this, if we still have time, is an issue I just wanted to also address, right? So this goes back to the oil, gas, and commodities, right? Yeah. Why don't we cut it off? And I've called it the Goldilocks sanction regime that we have now, which inflicts maximum upfront pain on Russia now, while minimizing pain on the West and the rest of the world, right? And because the fact of the matter is, if Putin cuts off oil, gas, and commodity, particularly food, that will be massively painful. Gas, particularly to the EU, oil indirectly through the price channel to the United States and the domestic politics there, and food and other commodities, particularly to emerging and developing economies. And so I think that is short of bombing NATO countries or EU countries, the biggest leverage Putin has over us today is his ability to cut these off anytime. So and if he has the ability and he's cornered like a rat into the corner, he will use it at some point or the other, right? So I think we shouldn't be the ones cutting oil, gas, and commodity exports off, but we should, on a war footing, in a coordinated way, as the international community, as the West, prepare for an exigency, an emergency, where we assume that all of this will be cut off, right? And even without them being cut off, the price impacts are already clear. And I said self-sanctioning means, their supply is slowly getting depleted. It's just a matter of time before at least, more and more squeeze happens. And this means, of course, much higher near-term inflation. And that's a macro problem we have been struggling with. This means large distributive consequences that are very regressive, right? I mean, with higher food price, gas prices, it's going to have the biggest impact on the poorest in the world and within the EU, etc. And the way, if you compare, even limiting, oil, gas, or commodity flows by 5 to 15%, which is what Russia is capable of doing. And particularly if you look at, Ukraine's contribution to food commodity exports too, the price impact could easily be, 50 to 100%, right? And that price impact will apply to all the trading that happens in oil, gas, etc. Right? So this is why I've been very strongly advocating against us cutting this off, because if Russia does this, the only thing it loses is $1 or $2 billion of export revenue on a daily basis. but the impact on the rest of the world will easily be $50 to $100 billion a day, right? So cutting off real economy exports from Russia on these three will have an order of magnitude larger impact on us. So I think we should fully expect a recession. ECB and other monetary policy easing should be postponed. An extension of the EU Next Gen Fund and other funds, which will be able to help countries asymmetrically, affected by this, as well as a special facility, maybe housed at the IMF to support developing emerging economies is the way. And the world should be willing to live with, recession, high inflation, and macroeconomic problems for the foreseeable future. And last but not the least, all the voluntary, BP getting out of Rosneft, et cetera, initiatives that are happening across the board. Clearly, BP shouldn't tell Rosneft, hey, we don't own 20% of you anymore, right? Because that, of course, clearly delivers money straight into Putin's hands. So the answer to all of this, ad hoc, voluntary self-sanctioning is to set up a coordinated trust fund, perhaps under the aegis of the United Nations, where these assets, sources of income, et cetera, would be warehoused and could be in the future used to part compensate Ukraine as war reparations, part help rebuild a post-Putin Russian economy, and part to be returned back to owners, part proceeds, where if there's any spare money left.
Yes, thank you for this, Sony. That's exactly what I wanted to ask you about, on this kind of your idea of what to do with these frozen assets. By the way, there's a very quick question, more logistical, is whether, I mean, this is on record here, right? What you said.
Yeah.
Just because this was a question. Now, actually, one thing I want to also mention, I mean, so definitely what you kind of foresee here is a very dire economic and financial picture, of course, for the globe, and of course, this will have implications. And we've seen these implications, of course, already for not just monetary fiscal policy, but ultimately also for the structure of the economic union. Maybe one kind of silver lining, if you might say so, is actually what Alessio pointed out, Alessio De Vincenzo, is that actually this might help us also more rapidly move away from fossil fuels, right? So that's maybe, well, again, it's tough to talk about silver lines in these circumstances.
No, completely, right? So at the when the Euro crisis happened, if you looked at the, Spain and what was caught out as, a deficit country, right? I mean, if you looked at the large magnitudes of the deficit of the countries that suffered most against the Euro crisis, and you set that aside against their fossil fuel import bills, there was a roughly 1-to-1 correspondence, right? So we made a point back then that from a macro economic stability point of view, the minimizing dependence and accelerating the green transition would be sensible. And then the CIA came out with a report about, the national security dimension of climate change that focused more on physical risks. But I think, following the crisis now, climate policy is defense policy, right? And even before this crisis hit, we were fully aware that our money was going towards authoritarian regimes in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in Russia. We have been fully funding every single thing they've been doing, from the Wahhabi school of Islamic extremism, etc., and with open eyes. So I think this is a wake-up call to which adds one even more a sort of additional element, so much so that if one thinks of defense budgets, climate policy is defense policy too, right? So part of the defense budget should be going towards immediately minimizing any kind of dependence on fossil fuels. And of course, the green transition comes with its own supply chain issues, etc. But very importantly, going to flow and stock, that is a flow issue, right? So while replacing fossil fuel with solar and wind and electricity grid, there are transition issues of dependence on minerals, on dodgy regimes, etc. But once steady state has been reached, you are no longer dependent on the OPEC cartel to be able to, turn off the oil in a second, right? So I think the steady state version of the green economy is carries far less geopolitical risk, but the transition really does need to be accelerated.
Okay, well, on this note, thank you very much, Sony. I mean, these are extraordinary circumstances and scary times, but I think you gave us a clear picture of how actually among all of these emotions, and if you look at a Q&A box, they're clearly there, and these are very emotional reactions, of course, to the invasion, to the aggressions. We still have to keep as cool a head as possible, and I think that's also where the contribution of people like us, economists, academics, comes in to basically help, again, as I started out with my initial remarks, do our small little contribution to defending democracy, freedom, and peace. So along this note, thank you again very much, Sony, for this conversation, and thank you very much for all of the participants for staying with us and for also contributing your questions in the Q&A box. Thank you very much and have a good day.